Robert, you've been involved in the business and human rights debate for over a decade now. Would you say that this law, the German Supply Chain Act, comes as a surprise to many in Germany?
Well, Tina, the business community is quite mixed in Germany. There were indeed some companies that are rather progressive and they welcomed this legislation even. But others prefer to ignore the process or even opposed it. Eventually, this legislation was unavoidable. For a long time, there was an approach of voluntariness. It was believed that companies, in order to protect their reputation, would have an incentive enough to avoid child labor and modern forms of slavery and other violations in their supply chains. But that approach has proven to fail, and that's why over the last 10 or 15 years, several countries have come forward and enacted HRDD statutes that require companies to avoid human rights risks.
HRDD meaning what?
Human rights due diligence. Human rights due diligence does not mean that companies have to guarantee that no violations take place in their value chains, but it means that they have to make an effort with reasonable means to avoid violations.
And so the German Supply Chain Act is one of these due diligence statutes that now exists.
That's right. And I would say this German Act is actually one of the most aspiring ones of all the statutes.
How so?
Well, first of all, the duties will apply to German companies with at least 1,000 employees in Germany, and that's about 2,900 German companies. Less than 1% of all of them, but they do account for a significant share of the international trade. And the duties will also apply to foreign companies that merely have a branch in Germany and 1,000 employees in Germany.
Right.
That's 1,900 foreign companies.
In total.
Quite a number.
Quite a number. So which are the human rights obligations that they have to look out for or that they sign up for?
The companies have to consider 12 human rights risks and 3 environmental risks. These human rights risks are both specific and general. 11 of the human rights risks relate to slave labor, child labor, equal treatment at work, also land rights and other human rights. And then there is a catch-all clause that can relate to all other human rights under the 2 international covenants by the United Nations. And then there are 3 environmental risks that also need to be considered. So that's quite a number. And the companies must implement a management system that ensures that the risks are identified and mitigated where possible.
Right. So that's the way, that would be my next sort of question. How do they actually manage to monitor these risks?
It starts with the top management. The CEOs, the managing directors need to make sure that staff in the company is appointed that is responsible for supervising the management processes and also must put policies in place that ensure that risks are identified and addressed. That starts with regular risk analysis, and risks that are identified must be also dealt with in a policy statement by the companies. Expectations regarding the direct suppliers must be defined in that policy, and then preventive measures must be taken to ensure that human rights risks are reduced. Mitigative measures must be taken when risks materialize. A complaint mechanism must be implemented that must be available in the entire value chains. And the companies must document its diligence, maintain the documentation for 7 years, and report annually on the due diligence measures taken.
Yeah. I know there has been a lot of debate about the area in which the companies have to apply these measures, right? And as I understand it, it's their immediate business area, and then beyond that, the companies that they have a direct contractual relationship with. Is that right, or is it even further reaching?
The regular duty of diligence ends at the first tier in the supply chain, that's true, but it would be a fallacy to believe that diligence needs not be applied deeper in the value chain at all. In 2 cases, diligence must be applied ad hoc. companies must apply diligence when prompted by circumstances such as substantial knowledge of potential human rights violations anywhere in the supply chain. And that substantial knowledge can come from any source. And also, importantly, there is a second duty to apply diligence in the entire value chain, and that is whenever the risk situation in the value chain changes, for instance, because the company introduces new products or projects or enters new business fields.
Yeah, so that means as time goes by, the companies cannot sort of say, we've done this, let's move on. They have to investigate and go deeper and deeper into these issues.
Exactly, that's it. And that's why I say that over time, the diligence applied in the supply chain reaches the extent that is suggested by the United Nations Guiding Principles on Human Rights and Business.
Right. But that does sound like there's a lot to do for companies. Do you think they can actually manage this?
It's a huge challenge. Many of the large companies have hundreds of entities all around the world and hundreds of thousands of suppliers all around the globe. It's quite a challenge for them to even get an overview on the business activities they are involved in. And that really means that human rights due diligence starts with a clear, substantial and honest commitment by the top management.
I've been told that the provisions for enforcement within the German law are actually far-reaching and very detailed in comparison to other laws like these that exist. Is that right? Would you say they are? And if so, can you explain the enforcement mechanisms a little bit for us?
Yeah, the authority's enforcement competences are indeed quite remarkable. The authority will not only review the annual reports published by the company, but it can also enter company premises, interrogate staff, ask for documentation to be surrendered, and order the company to improve its diligence. The company by law is obliged to cooperate with the authority, and if it doesn't, the company can be issued fines in order to make the company comply. When there are risks that materialize and the company has violated its duties under this act, the company can be issued significant fines up to 8 million euros or 2% of the annual turnover. And that then also means that the company will be barred from public procurement for a number of years.
Right. That all sounds very impressive. But would you still say, if you look at the law, that there is room for improvement?
Well, it has been criticized a lot that the access to justice for victims of human rights violations hasn't been improved significantly. Right. It is true that on the one hand, the victims of corporate human rights violations are given the chance to empower labor unions or NGOs to file litigation on their behalf. But substantially, the legal situation is not really clearly improved by the law. It is left up to the civil courts to decide whether the duties of diligence under this act can be considered within the grey areas of existing tort law. Mostly foreign tort law has to be applied. So to apply the law in court is quite difficult, and that remains the same, more or less.
Interesting. So, summing up, I've understood that the law makes a huge contribution to guaranteeing human rights. Would you go further and say that it also makes a contribution to reaching the Sustainable Development Goals?
Absolutely. Many of the Sustainable Development Goals, I believe, will be affected positively by implementing these legal duties. For instance, poverty may be reduced, the working conditions should become much more decent, water will be cleaner, drinking water, also access to sanitation, child labor should be reduced. So overall, I expect that the Sustainable Development Goals will gain significantly from these statutes, especially if the European Union comes up with similar legislation that would be applied to even more companies in all over Europe.
Very interesting. Thank you so much, Robert. We look forward to reading your analysis and to seeing what's happening on the European level. Thank you.
You're welcome, Tina. Thank you.